Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining for the webinar this afternoon. This is our third and final webinar in the September series on coastal flooding and climate change. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kate McClure. I'm the Coastal Climate Specialist with the Maryland Sea Grant Extension Program. And I'm based at the Y Research and Education Center over on the Eastern Shore, but I work with coastal communities throughout the entire state on issues related to climate change and in particular flooding and sea level rise. So if you were with us the last week, you'll know that we were talking all about causes of coastal flooding and also discuss some online tools for understanding your flood risk. So today we are finally getting into talking about some of the things we can actually do about those flooding issues. If you weren't able to make the webinar last week, that's entirely not an issue. It's not a prerequisite. However, if you are interested in catching it along with the one on the 9th, were both recorded, and those are going to be posted on the Extension Coastal Climate website, the link on the page you're looking at now. Those should be up sometime next week. So before we get started talking about strategies for reducing flood risk, just a couple housekeeping notes to review. With the Zoom webinar, you have options for communicating both through a chat and through a Q&A feature. The chat, I encourage you to use if you have any additional thoughts or resources you'd like to share with other participants or respond to any questions I ask. But if you have any questions that you're looking for an answer from me about anything I mentioned today, it would help me out if you put that in the Q&A. Sometimes things can get a little bit lost in the chat, and making sure questions are in the Q&A will help me make sure that I don't miss anything and get to all of your questions. There's also an option if you raise your virtual hand, I can unmute you if you would prefer to ask a question that way, but I should mention that this webinar is being recorded, just so you're aware. So today we are talking about some of the different strategies that can be used to reduce flood risk. And the outline of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to kind of start small and move bigger. So we're going to start off by talking about some of the actions you can take to keep household members safe during floods. Then we're going to scale up to talking about actions and projects that can protect your home and property from flooding. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the strategies you can consider for reducing flood risk in your neighborhood or community. So we're going to kind of start small, move a little bit bigger, and then even bigger than that. And today we are going to cover kind of a lot. If you're interested in more details about anything I mentioned, please ask. I am more than happy to elaborate on anything or point you in the direction of the people or resources who can. So starting off, I'm going to talk about some of the things you can do to keep your household members safe during a flood. And if you were with us last week, you might recall that we talked a little bit about how coastal flooding issues can range from these chronic or recurrent, sometimes they're called flooding events, sometimes it's called nuisance flooding. It'll be something that maybe happens often, but is typically maybe just like a few inches or so of water. It can range from that sort of frequent, smaller scale flooding, all the way to really extreme flooding disasters. For example, after with a hurricane, there can be a storm surge that brings in several feet of water and create really devastating flooding conditions. And so when we're talking about reducing flood risk at the household member level, we're really going to be focusing more over on the right side of this arrow, just because that sort of flooding has the potential to be really quite dangerous. And keeping everyone safe is the most important thing. I mean, whenever I talk about flooding, it's great to be able to think about the sorts of actions we can take to protect our houses from flooding, but first and foremost, always the first priority to make sure that all the people are as safe as they can be. And just as a reminder, this is the thing about like safety during disasters such as flooding. This is where agencies such as the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or the Maryland, the state level version of that, the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, MEMA, and your local emergency management offices. These are the experts, and they all have a ton of information about how to prepare for disasters, including flooding as well as others. But I am going to share a few points on those, but I just wanted to point out that these are the experts and where you can always go for more information. So when thinking about actions to keep people in your household safe during a flood, one of the first most important things you can do is to make a disaster plan. And so that can include things like how to communicate with other family members, where you would go if evacuation was necessary, how you would get there. These sorts of plans are often really, it's a good idea to revisit them periodically. This is something I think we've seen in the last now 18 months or so. I mean, with the COVID pandemic constantly evolving, that could very well affect some of your plans on what you would do if evacuation was necessary and what sort of transportation or options would be best for you and your family. Another key step you can take is to build an emergency supply kit. This is something, there are a lot of checklists available online. I have the website listed here, ready.gov. This is a federal website. It has a ton of information about preparing for different sorts of disasters, it has specific sections on flooding and hurricanes, but it's a great place to start if you're looking for ideas on what to put in an emergency supply kit. And things like this, as well as a disaster plan, can be really helpful for floods, but also any other sorts of disasters that you might have to encounter. And when you're thinking about these plans and these kits, I always like to remind everyone that we want to make sure we're thinking about all of our household members, which includes not just the people, but also our furry or scaled or amphibian skin, slimy household members. This is something that, especially if evacuation is ever something you need to consider, that having a plan in place for pets can be really important to think about in advance. And so one other thing you can do in this line of safety that is Maryland and hurricane specific is Maryland has designated different zones. We have the A, B, and C zones for potential evacuation during a hurricane or other storm. And there's a website, it's knowyourzonemd.com, where you can enter your address and see what zone you are situated in, which can then help you know whether to evacuate or shelter in place if there is a storm. And then if you do end up needing to evacuate or leave your home for any reason during a flood, make sure that you and your family members are aware of the potential hazards of walking or driving through floodwaters. Surprisingly, small amounts of water can be really dangerous. Like even 6 inches of water can knock over and carry away a pedestrian. And then, a foot of water can sweep away a car, and 2 feet can carry away a larger vehicle. So always the saying that always kind of goes to my head is, when you see a flooded road, turn around, don't drown, is important advice to keep in mind. And then finally, if there is a significant flood event after returning home, there are a number of safety considerations to keep in mind. Floodwaters can be really dirty and contaminated with sewage and bacteria and other things. So trying to avoid wading in them as much as possible, and being sure to throw out any food that was exposed, and cleaning and disinfecting anything that got wet. These are all things that can help make sure that you stay safe and healthy, not only during a flood event, but then after as well. And Maryland has, I want to show this one other resource, the Maryland's Hurricane Evacuation Guide. It has a lot of great information about both knowing about whether you might need to evacuate, how to do so, how to prepare, and then what to do after you return back. So that can be a helpful resource as well. So I just wanted to see, I am curious where everyone is with their preparedness. I'm just going to launch a quick poll, if you could take a minute to respond, as to whether you have an emergency plan and if you have an emergency supply kit. And Zoom does not let me answer my own poll questions, but I think I'm kind of in the sort of category for both of these. Like, I think I have most of the things I should have in an emergency supply kit, but they aren't actually all together. And somehow my flashlights never have working batteries. I don't know why that is, but every time I reach for it, they're dead. Okay, I'm gonna leave this poll up for just another 5 seconds or so if you'd like to answer. Yeah, and so it looks like a lot of you are in the same boat as me of sort of having some of these things, but there's more to do. And then, or some of us haven't actually started. And kudos to those of you who have a plan and kit already in place. And I will also just point out that coincidentally, September happens to be National Preparedness Month. So if you are in the know or sort of category for either of those, you have about 1 more week in September. And if you'd like to observe National Preparedness Month by working on either of those for your household. Okay, so next we're going to talk some about some of the actions you can take to protect your home and your property from flooding. And these activities range from relatively small, low-cost projects up to some that are really involved and time and financially involved. So kind of cover a range of things that you could consider doing about flooding on your property. So first off, we're going to talk about some of the things you can do actually inside your home to keep your home and possessions safe. So one of the easiest places to start is by storing documents and valuables at higher elevations or in watertight containers. And by that, I mean, it can be really convenient to store those family photo albums in the basement, but maybe just think about where things like that are being stored and if it is a place that is more likely to be flooded, if it would be possible to move them, to store them a bit higher or protect them in something waterproof. Another thing you consider doing is installing a sump pump. A lot of houses in Maryland already have these. That's something that can help pump groundwater out and help prevent basement flooding. Particularly in some of our coastal areas, the groundwater level is relatively high. It's close to the ground surface. So sump pumps can be important for avoiding basement flooding. Ideally, if you put one of these in, it'll have a battery backup. Often, so that way they can keep operating even if there's an electrical outage. Unfortunately, often the times that we most need sump pumps are the same times that power outages are also a potential concern. So something to look out for. A little bit of a larger action to take is to install something called flood vents into a house. These are openings. So these are what's pictured on the right-hand side of the slide. And so these are openings that can actually allow the flood water to flow into a otherwise enclosed area, such as a crawl space or a garage. And it's maybe a little bit counterintuitive at first that you're making holes in a building to let water in. But the reason for this is that these openings that allow water in prevent water pressure building up that can destroy walls and foundations. So if the building crawl space is totally sealed off, you'll have all the water pressure on the outside of the building during a flood, and that can cause potentially really severe structural damage to the building. Whereas by having these sorts of openings, it means that water is entering and will be flowing through and making things wet and dirty with floodwaters, but it can preserve the structural integrity of a building. And this is something that, this is a building feature that in some places in high-risk flood zones might be required, but you can also, it's often possible to install them in buildings after they've already been constructed. If you have these or install them, it's just important to make sure that you're keeping them free after they're installed. You don't want them to be blocked by things. Sometimes we see people having flood vents, but they are blocked out. They're either covered or blocked by something which would prevent them from serving their purpose during a flood. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. And one other thing you can consider doing is using more flood resistant building materials, particularly in lower levels of buildings or basements. You could consider using things like, instead of wood floors or carpets, things that would be damaged by flooding, to try to use things like tile or vinyl or rubber that would be able to recover from being wet a little bit better. And one resource for some more information about these about smaller scale actions you can take both inside and outside the home is this little brochure created by FEMA. It's called Protect Your Home from Flooding, Low Cost Projects you can do yourself. It's available online. I also happen to have a stack of them sitting around. If you would like one, I'd be more than happy to mail one to you if you email me an address, or you can private message me through the chat. It's a short brochure. It's probably only about 6 pages or so with several pictures, but I think it's a pretty nice overview of some of these different actions you could do as a homeowner. So next, moving on to thinking about some of the things you can do outside the house. So like on your property, so outside the house, but on your property. One thing is to elevate the HVAC or other mechanical, HVAC mechanical units or other equipment. So if you can see in this picture, I think those are, it looks like air conditioning heat pumps. I'm not entirely sure why they have so many, but that aside, you can see that the 3 or 4 on the left are up on these little platforms, and the one on the right had, I think that might be a generator, is up on little legs. And so by just raising these pieces of equipment up, it means that if there is flooding, those pieces of equipment won't be damaged by water. And then that's something that you won't need to pay to replace. And so a few other things you could consider doing depending on the sort of flooding you're experiencing and the causes are these sort of smaller scale stormwater management practices, we call these. So doing things like cleaning gutters and reducing runoff by reducing impervious surfaces or installing rain gardens. These are things that can be appropriate for certain types of flooding. And so in the picture over on the right, this is showing a rain garden. So rain gardens are designed to help absorb some of the stormwater runoff after a precipitation event and have it more slowly, have a place to store it as it can like more slowly seep into the ground. So that, or a rain barrel, these aren't things that are going to solve a flooding problem from if there's a huge storm that drops 6 inches of water, or if there's a big storm surge or even recurrent nuisance flooding. Like these aren't the sorts of practices that would really help that sort of flooding. But if you are in a situation where there are parts of your yard that are staying wet after rain events, and that seems to be caused by sort of like more like the regular precipitation sort of flooding, these are things that can be helpful to consider doing. And I would like to point out that if you are interested in potentially implementing one of these sorts of things or are unsure if it might be the right move for you and your property, the Sea Grant Extension Program actually has a whole team of 5 watershed restoration specialists who focus on these different sorts of stormwater management practices. And one of them or I could do a site visit if you wanted to talk through whether these sorts of practices might help with your flooding issue or not. And then if you do decide to proceed, how to go about doing that. And the other nice thing about these stormwater management practices is that in addition to helping alleviate some smaller scale flooding issues, they can also help improve water quality. So there can be some nice kind of co-benefits of that nature as well. So another action you can take. This is, we are moving up from, we've moved beyond the smaller scale practices to some of the larger scale actions now. And one thing you can consider doing if flooding is an issue for your house is to either elevate it, actually raise it up, or move it to another location on your property. Sometimes, especially on waterfront property, if a owner has enough land, sometimes the house was built long ago, there will be, it might be in a part of the property that is more flood prone than other parts. And so by moving the house a bit, it can address some of those flooding issues as well. And so these are things that are not cheap to do, but can be quite effective if you want to avoid having flooding in your home. Another point to consider is that, first off, not all houses can be elevated. It depends on how they were built, what the foundation is like, lots of factors that an engineer is definitely who you want to talk to about that. But it almost always costs more to elevate a house that already exists than to build one higher already. So if you are in the situation of doing new construction near the coast, this is something you might want to think about when you are designing the building as to how high up you would like it to be. And just one other point, if you decide to go the route of trying to elevate a building, I always just try to encourage people to make sure you also think about how flooding might be impacting the surrounding land as also. Elevating a house can protect it from flooding, but if there's water all around it and it's difficult to drive to it or access the house, that can cause other problems that you might want to think about before investing a lot of resources in this sort of mitigation action. And one last action I want to mention that you can do on your property. This is specifically for properties that are actually along the coastline, is sometimes flooding can be contributed to by shoreline erosion. That if you have as your shoreline erodes, as sea levels get higher and from waves and from storms, that can make flooding happen more regularly closer to a home. And so here in Maryland, there are regulations that require, in most cases, a living shoreline, like we're seeing in this picture, something that mimics a natural shoreline, that in most cases, you will be required to do something like this instead of building a seawall or doing some other hardened sort of structure along the shoreline. And there are, of course, many exceptions to that. It can be a little bit of a complex permitting issue, but these living shorelines can be pretty effective at preventing some erosion and even allowing more accretion of marshes and these habitats that can help reduce the amount of flooding that's happening. And they also have other benefits as well by enhancing wetland habitats. They can also, in many cases, are actually cheaper to install than something like a seawall, and cheaper to install and maintain than a seawall. And so this is something that if you do have a shoreline property that you're concerned about erosion and are interested in pursuing a living shoreline potentially, the Department of Natural Resources actually has a few programs available that can offer some technical assistance and sometimes even financial assistance for property owners who are interested in doing a living shoreline on their property. So this is the point where someone usually asks why you don't just build a berm or a levee to keep the water out. You know, if we're worried about flooding, why not just build a barrier that keeps the water out? Does anyone have any ideas as to why this isn't always the most effective way of dealing with flooding? If you have any ideas on that, you can put it in the chat. This picture actually was, it's not from Maryland. It's from near the Mississippi River, I believe, after a large storm they had in, I think back in 2011 or so. Yeah, so see a few things in the chat. Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, yes. And you don't know how high the waters will get in the future. Yeah, so there are a few issues with this sort of approach to flooding. First off, depending on where your property is located, there are probably several permits you would need to get in order to do this. And I suspect they would not be easy to get, but regulatory issues aside, the big issue is back to, as we mentioned, that, you know, thinking about what sort of action is appropriate depends on the cause and the type of flooding. And so in this case, this wall was built up specifically to deal with a river that was overflowing. And to be fair, in this case, it looks quite effective. That house would be underwater and it is dry. But a lot of times, a lot of the flooding we're dealing with, so as several of you are mentioning in the chat, there isn't anywhere for rainwater to go. So this isn't going to be something that would really work as a good long-term solution. If you look at this, it's built a bowl, and bowls fill with water, or they can if it rains. So the issue is that if you get water inside it, it has nowhere to go. In theory, you could pump it out, which is essentially what New Orleans does to manage their water. You know, they have levees that keep ocean water out and pumps to remove stormwater from the city. But the issue with pumps is that they can, and sometimes do, fail. They're also expensive and difficult to maintain. So for all those reasons are why this isn't really an approach we recommend. And in addition to thinking about the appropriate sorts of actions for your type of flooding, you also want to make sure that whatever you're doing isn't going, if you're doing something to address one type of flooding, you want to make sure that it's not going to actually make other sorts of flooding worse. And so one other point when you're thinking about ways to protect your home and property, flood insurance is something you can consider as a way to financially protect yourself from flood damage. I think it's really important to realize and appreciate that your homeowner's insurance almost certainly does not cover flood damage. And so last week we talked a bit about the different FEMA flood zones. And so in some of those areas, if you have a mortgage, you'd be required by your lender to have flood insurance. But flood insurance is available to everyone in Maryland through the National Flood Insurance Program. So you don't have to be in a special zone in order to get flood insurance. It's open to anyone. And in fact, flooding can be really problematic even outside that FEMA designated zone. So it's something you might want to consider even if you aren't in that required area, or if you don't have a mortgage, that means that you have to have flood insurance. And so through the National Flood Insurance Program, policies cover up to $250,000 of damage to a home structure and $100,000 to the home's contents. And I know that in many places in Maryland, that is likely not nearly enough to cover the cost of a home's value. So it's also possible to buy additional insurance through private insurers if you would like coverage on top of that. And the cost of flood insurance can vary a lot depending on several different factors. FEMA is actually just now changing how they calculate those premiums. So if you do have a flood insurance policy, you might see a little bit of a change in how much it costs the next time it renews. But how much it costs can depend on where the property is located, how close it is to water, as well as some of the features of what the structure is like. And one other point to keep in mind is that some of the mitigation actions that we were talking about, doing things like installing flood vents, elevating utilities, or elevating structures, those are things that might be able to actually reduce how much you have to pay for flood insurance. And that's something that you can even get a quote on before deciding to do one of these projects. So that is something you might want to consider as well. And there is a ton of information out there available on flood insurance. The National Flood Insurance Program's website, floodsmart.gov, is a good place to start, but then also talking to insurance agents about specifics as that would apply to you as well. So I have two more poll questions for you. I am curious whether any of you have actually done any of these actions already, or if they're things that you are potentially interested in doing in the future. And I see I have one question in the Q&A about how to find out your property's flood risk, especially with regards to flood insurance policy. And so that is something we talked about at the last webinar. Was focused all about that. When I get the recording posted, I'd suggest checking that out. But I will also just share the link to one of the mapping features that we talked about there, the marylandfloodmaps.net. That, I'm gonna put this in the chat. I can't figure out how to type an answer under the Q&A. So that website is where you can check whether you are in a FEMA designated flood zone in Maryland that would require having flood insurance. Okay, I'm gonna leave this whole question up for just like another 5 seconds if anyone else would like to answer. Okay, looks like like several people have already started taking some actions to make their homes more flood resistant by either installing flood vents, elevating equipment, installing rain gardens. That's great. And then several others are interested in these as well. And so this is something, if you are interested in doing one of these and are looking for, I know what we're talking about today during the presentation is it's a little bit high level or not super detailed. If you're looking for more specific information about doing any of these, I am happy to talk more about that with you, if that would be helpful. Okay, so now moving on. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today are some of the ways that you can make your neighborhood or your community more resilient to flooding. And this is really important because a lot of these more kind of like chronic or recurrent flooding issues aren't just affecting one house. A lot of times they are affecting whole areas or neighborhoods. So just a couple examples of what I mean by that. So this is a picture taken out on Cooper's Island in Dorchester County. This is a picture of this road. If you can see the arrows pointing to it, it's this narrow causeway that connects the middle Cooper Island to the upper one. And it's the only way in and out of the lower part of the island. And so if it floods, which happens not infrequently, because as you can see, it's not that far above the ocean level. So if it is impacted by flooding, that's something that affects everyone who lives south of that road. And this is kind of an extreme case of this, but there are actually kind of a lot of places in Maryland where regularly flooding roads either cuts off access to or seriously impacts or inconveniences a neighborhood or community. And here's another example. This one is from Oxford, Maryland. It's around what's called the Strand Beach in Oxford. And this is a place that has been seeing more and more flooding issues during high tides, and the shoreline is starting to erode. And this is impacting a road that's important for accessing some places, but also some infrastructure. You can see these telephone poles, there's a fire hydrant. These aren't things that are meant to be flooded regularly. And this is also a place that is used for recreation and water access. So it's important to the community for other reasons as well. And so these sorts of larger flooding issues, we're not just talking about water impacting like one home or one property. These larger scale issues that are affecting more people often require bigger solutions to do things like, maybe elevate a road or restore a larger section of shoreline or improve stormwater management in a whole section of a town. And these are things that usually can take a fair amount of time, money, and partners. Like, this isn't something that one individual homeowner is going to be able to solve on their own. But luckily, there are some funding sources available. There are grants available from federal, state, and NGO sources that can be used for doing these sorts of flood resilience projects. Different grant programs have very different requirements, and the best funding source depends a lot on the specifics of the project. But the thing to keep in mind is that while there are grants available, the funds are still usually kind of limited. I mean, this is a big issue nationally and internationally, that with climate change and sea level rise, the amount of money available through existing programs just isn't enough to solve every flooding and climate change related issue that exists. And another note about these sorts of excuse me, federal, state, and nonprofit funding sources is that these grant opportunities, not necessarily always, but usually need to go through either a local government entity or some other group, like maybe an academic institution or a nonprofit. These sorts of larger grants that could potentially be used for these larger scale flooding issues, like they aren't going to individual residents. There's often requirements that it needs to be either going to a local government or some other established group. So something else to keep in mind. But if there is a flooding issue in your neighborhood that you're looking to address, I have a few pointers on where to think about starting with that. So one of the first steps you can take is to start talking to your neighbors about the flooding problem and get them on board with doing something about it. The reason I say this is that one resident talking about a problem can be powerful, but having a whole neighborhood or group of people all concerned about flooding can be really motivating for local governments or other groups to help take action to address these problems. Another important step you can take is to start documenting the flooding problem. You know, sometimes people say a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think that applies here, taking pictures of the flooding that you've seen and keeping track of when it happens, what it impacts, and how frequently it occurs is important for when you're looking to address a problem. If you're asking for funds or assistance, one of the first things you're going to be asked is, okay, well, where is it flooding? Is it flooding, and how often is it happening? And being able to show what you're experiencing can be really helpful for furthering that, especially because some of the sort of flooding, even if it's happening, you know, once a month, twice a month, you know, way too often to be acceptable, it's not happening every day. So when it is happening, making sure to take those pictures or document it another way. And the next step I'd recommend is thinking about starting to reach out to either local government staff or other potential partners, depending on where you're located in Maryland. There are some nonprofit groups that are really interested in working on this area. There can be academic partners who are also interested in working on this. I know it can be difficult even within your local government, knowing who to talk to and getting in touch with them. But this is something that I and my Sea Grant Extension colleagues can help you out with. I mean, we are available to help with any of these steps, but in particular, thinking about who to talk to in order to try to get the attention and potentially the ball rolling to get some resources for actually addressing a flooding problem in your neighborhood. And one other way to potentially start getting some action on these flooding issues is, I always like to recommend to participate whenever your local jurisdiction is updating a plan related to flooding. I know this doesn't sound like the most exciting thing to do, but every local jurisdiction, your city or your county has a number of different plans that are updated at either every 5 or 10 years that can relate to flooding. So comprehensive plans are updated every 10 years and have to do with long-term land use planning that can impact how flooding might happen in the community in the future. Hazard mitigation and flood mitigation plans focus on how the jurisdiction is going to address flooding and other hazards, and if you are aware of a flooding problem in your neighborhood, getting that recognized in one of these plans can open up other funding sources. For example, there are funds available from FEMA, but in order to receive them, it needs to be for things included in a hazard mitigation plan. So it can just be like another opportunity for getting attention and resources for a flooding issue. And all of these plans, there are always opportunities for public participation, and I encourage you to keep an eye out for that. Like I said, this isn't something that's happening all the time. It's more of a 5 to 10 year basis. So when those opportunities do come up though, it can be helpful. And I do just want to mention that, like, with these larger scale projects to mitigate flooding, there usually aren't any very quick fixes. Even the best case scenario, it can take a while to really see these projects through to being implemented. A lot of times what will happen is that it will need to start with a study or an assessment to understand the problem and potential solutions. And from there, it would need to go to developing engineering plans. And then finally, after it's permitted, it would go to construction. So just as a few examples, thinking back to this Cooper's Island example, they recently were awarded a grant from the Department of Natural Resources to do a resiliency study. And so this means that they're going to be doing a sort of an assessment or a study to try to look at what sorts of flood protection measures might be effective at dealing with the flooding that's happening now and will happen in the future. So this is kind of like the first step towards doing something about this flooding issue. It's the starting to better understand the problem. And as another example, back to our Strand Beach and Oxford example, they received funding and have their engineering designs to do a living shoreline project in that area to address the flooding and erosion issues. I think they're in the process now of waiting on permits. And they've secured funding for construction on one side of the road and are seeking it for construction on the other. And this has been going on now for, I think the whole process has been continuing for a couple years now. So it's not something that, even once you have partners on board and start getting funding, it can still take some time to start actually before there are projects actually moving on the ground. And the last point I always like to make is that in addition to there not being quick fixes to these larger flooding problems, I think it's important to recognize that it's not always going to be feasible to completely solve or prevent every flooding problem. And so in some cases, we might need to sort of rethink how we live with the water to a certain extent and start to recognize that we're living in a changing landscape. So for example, there might be some areas of lawns that are just consistently wet and salty that will eventually transition to marsh plants instead of the turf grass we're used to. And we might need to start to adjust some expectations of what a lawn should look like in certain areas. And some of those mitigation projects for homes that we talked about earlier, things like elevating structures, raising mechanical equipment, things like that can be really helpful for living with intermittent flooding, as well as some other creative solutions, such as this water level indicator. This is something that can help drivers see if there's too much water on the road to drive through. It's not going to prevent flooding from happening, but it can help prevent vehicles from being damaged. So if you are facing flooding issues in your neighborhood or community, I encourage you to start trying to advocate for those large scale projects that you need, but also keep a lookout for the smaller actions you can take to make the problem more manageable, and think about what sorts of water related changes in the landscape you might be willing to accept. So with that, we are almost up at 1 o'clock. I am more than happy to answer any questions. I see there's one in the Q&A that I will work on addressing, but if anyone else has one, you can also pop that into the Q&A as well. I'm also just gonna put up this is my contact information. If you think of anything later that you would like to ask, I am always willing to. And while you are thinking of any other questions, I just wanted to, I know I ask this every time, but if you do have a minute, it's really helpful for us in Extension to get some feedback from our audiences on our programs. So if you do have a minute, I would appreciate if you could take a second to fill out this, this feedback form. It's super quick, like 6 questions. Okay, so I think I have one question in the Q&A. I think you all can see it, but I'm gonna go ahead and read it. It says, is there a threshold, benchmark, or any parameters to be used to facilitate a decision as to when a planned permanent migration or retreat is the best, most reasonable and realistic option for a landowner or community? And if so, are there any agencies or professionals developing a tool that addresses for public distribution? While all the presented info is valuable, it is for the short term. We need to know when to call it quits, when to abandon an area. So that's a good question. And so my answer to that is that I don't think that is something that agencies or professionals should be telling people. So in terms of deciding when, so like we know that flooding is becoming more and more common, but in terms of deciding when there is too much water and too much flooding, that continuing to live there isn't a feasible path forward, that to me is a decision that the people living there need to make. And that's something that I think that like I and my peers want to support people in making those choices, but it's not really the role of any agency to say that this is too much flooding, you need to leave. I don't think that that would really be an appropriate role for us. I mean, that said, there are, as we talked about last week, if you were around, there are some mapping tools that you can see what sea level rise flooding might look like in the future, which could help inform those decisions. This is something that some agencies or other entities might need to start thinking about in terms of where they're investing money. That, you know, if you're going to like build a new school, do you want to put it somewhere that is going to be flooded in 10 years or not? You know, you probably want to invest those resources in building somewhere that is less flood prone. But no, there isn't one set threshold or benchmark, and I don't see that as being something that's going to be developed. I think it's going to be more of a personal decision that different residents and communities are going to decide on when that will be enough. And so if one other question, it says, when do you expect the recordings to be uploaded to your website? Will they replace the registration links? Yeah, so the registration links are going to disappear. I think we're going to add another tab onto the website that will have recordings. I expect to get them uploaded next week. I apologize for the delay. I've just had a number of things on my plate this week in addition to keeping up with these webinars, but they will be on the website, the exact organizational framework of that to be determined. So with that, it's 1:02. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to ask away. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining today. And if you were with me any of the past weeks, I really appreciate your time and coming here and talking about flooding and climate change with me. And please take my contact information if you ever have follow-up questions or need anything more specific. Please reach out. It's my job to be here as a resource for you. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.